Hi, my friends who listen to Future Primitive. I'm on Skype today. I just want to tell you it's snowing here in Santa Fe a lot. And I'm on Skype with Daniel Christian Wahl, who is in Mallorca, where it's probably sunny. He is a whole systems design specialist and regenerative development generalist with a background in biology, ecology, and holistic science. Daniel's work contributes to a rise in regenerative practice in business leadership, education, policymaking, community design, and bioregional planning. He was the director of Findhorn College between 2007 and 2010. He has taught capacity building workshops on a wide range of sustainability issues. And let me pick and choose from his amazing bio. Daniel has worked closely with Gaia Education since 2006, when he participated in the first training of trainers for the Eco Village Design Education Program. He has taught courses in Scotland, Thailand, and in Spain. Welcome, Daniel. Would you like to add something to the stuff I said about you?
No, that was already more than needed. Maybe that in 2016 I wrote a book called Designing Regenerative Cultures.
Good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm holding in my hand his book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, Transformative Innovation, Biologically Inspired Design, Living Systems Thinking, and Health and Resilience. So, welcome. This book is about love and practicing the love of life. This is what Graham Leicester says in the intro. Would you speak about that, Daniel?
Well, it all comes down to love, doesn't it? Like Maturana and Varela said, we all bring forth the world together in conversation, and it is through the mutual attraction we have to life and each other as life that this whole thing shows up for us. So for me, reconnecting to our love for life and our love as healers of an unbroken whole is at the center of what I would call creating regenerative cultures. And I think Graham picked up on that in his introduction for the book, because when you try to bring it all back down to one word, the one word that kind of summarizes the impulse is love.
So then let's go to our future is in jeopardy. If you would summarize that statement in your own way, please.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could go into a whole tail dive on climate change and cascading ecosystems collapse and the fact that we've known that what we were doing was killing the planet and killing ourselves for probably about 50 years now, and we're only just getting to a point where maybe enough people are starting to say, this is madness, we need to act upon it, that we might still have a snowball's chance in hell to avoid this sixth greatest mass extinction, to get to a point where it also takes away our species out of the picture of Gaia as a living planet. So you can get pretty grim when you just look at the science these days, because the science looks bleak. Friend of mine, Kevin Barron, put it beautifully in a comment that he posted on Facebook on one of my articles. He wrote, "We're now at a point where we have to do the impossible because the probable has become unthinkable." And I think that kind of really hits the nail of where we're at. Yes. But then at the same time, when you ask about the future, I'm trying to really work with myself on thinking differently about time, because I think that time is one of those things we're somewhat trapped in, a misconceived notion of time, which is this whole story of the past to the present and off to the future, like this linear story that then very quickly also traps you in this idea of linear causality, of action and reaction, rather than secular patterns where everything influences everything else, and where consciousness has so much more to do about how the world shows up than the current scientific story allows us to do. And it's in that kind of space of reframing time and what future actually means when you bring it back to the one place it could ever be, which is the future potential of the present moment, because we're always only going to be in the now, right here. That maybe in coming home to that, we actually have a chance of quite literally re-patterning and re-mattering the future of life on Earth, and in that I see the potential of working a miracle. It's basically shift in consciousness first, and the world will follow.
Yes, absolutely. So my burning question is, with the heaviness of the trauma we carry, if only from the 20th century, but then from our non-reflexive past, and with the poverty that has been created by the greed in this world, how can we shift this monumental way of thinking?
Yeah, it's a question that I've been sitting with for 20 years. Mm-hmm. Increasingly in the last few years, I'm getting to the point where, as you just voiced that question, what came up was, maybe it is changing us rather than we change it. We've kind of created a situation where, by behaving like uninitiated teenagers, thinking that the world owed us something, or even worse, believing in a narrative of man over nature. And I say man on purpose, because it was that whole chauvinistic, macho, like we are the masters of nature story that at some point separated us from our real ground of being so much that we even now, in trying to undo the damage, we're asking, how can we do it? And if the whole thing is just one continuous transforming process, life as a planetary process, then the process is doing us just as much as we are doing it. And by just coming home to that agency of actually being so deeply connected with everything that everything matters. Everything, as a friend of mine, Gerald Mitchley says, everything is an intervention. Which if you take, like in our Western mindset, our conversation right now has no agency. It's just us talking. We're sort of trapped in a way of thinking that the only way that what we're now talking about would matter in the world is if we now came up with a plan and then we started some sort of action strategy, implementation plan and goalposts and started to go out there in the world and did something. But maybe if everything is interconnected and consciousness is much more primary than we dared to entertain in the last couple of 100 years, then this conversation in and of itself right now in this second, even if nobody ever listens to that podcasts in the future, actually has causal agency in the universe. And I think at that place we can turn everything around. And you're right, yes, we created a disgustingly unequal planet and have a huge amount of poverty that is the result of structural violence in the economic and monetary system that we designed. But because we designed it, we can also redesign it. And it's high time that we did, because otherwise all our other efforts are unlikely to bear fruit, because you can't build regenerative businesses and regenerative communities and regenerative practices if you still playing on a playing field and to rules that are zero-sum rules that need losers in order to generate winners. And that's basically the game we're like the playing field we were all trained to believe in and brought up in, and that's what pays our bills. And every time we spend any money, even if we buy ecologically and green energy and are super ethical consumers, we're still part of that degenerative system. And so, yeah, I think in understanding that everything is an intervention lies a paradoxical insight. On the one hand, it brings you into a humility that is really in a sort of mindfulness way and old wisdom tradition invitation way, inviting every one of us to be super mindful of every single word, every thought, every action, every way, that the way we are, not just what we do, because all of it matters and transforms the world. And that is facing that uncertainty of how it does that is incredibly humbling. So that's one side of the paradox. But at the same time, somewhere strangely in that humility also suddenly comes the understanding that because we're not just part of it, but we're actually it, we're all of it, and we're deeply connected with it or her. Everything has such agency that all of us have the power to change the future and the present and this thing that we are participating in and emerging out of. And that creates a huge amount of power and audacity. So it's the paradox between humility and audacity that I think we're now called to at this point.
Well, you have just explained to me, I feel that my life has great meaning, and yet I'm just a little thing here with a computer. And I'm just a little thing. But you've just explained why I feel so alive, because in my language, I believe that we are exquisitely improvising the future at every moment. I mean, I believe that my whole life is improvisation and that gives my life deep meaning. So a lot of this is a matter of meaning, isn't it?
Yeah,
a lot of this attending to all species. Changing culture or creating culture is a matter of meaning.
Yeah, even who we are ourselves is, and I mean beyond our kind of human storytelling and kind of the CVs that we can tell of what we've done, much deeper, like as beings, to understand that in the long history of our species, we as David Abrams so beautifully puts it, like our senses have been shaped by the hoot of the owl and the smell of wildflowers and literally running with or behind or after wolves, and that is really like where we take our embodied participation in the wider community of life, and somehow with these computers and this storytelling and this only focusing on thinking rather than the other ways of knowing, like intuition, feeling, and sensing, we sort of cut ourselves off from so much of what we really are, and I like the word improvisation, the way that you use the word improvisation, because it's for me, it speaks to accepting the limits of our knowing and accepting uncertainty, that there are no guarantees that we're going to take the right step and that we'll be around for much longer. But we still have to take steps. We have to improvise, and improvisation, like sort of like a jazz musician improvising along with the bigger ensemble, which is our communities and the wider community of life, and just keep responding to the different calls and the rhythms and the patterns that are out there, and somehow falling into syntony with it, and synergy with it. And yeah, so I think that's all we can do.
Co-creating a story, because I think a very important thing you bring up is we are worth it, and the question, why are we worth it? And I think that's the deepest, to me, that's the deepest question.
Yeah, that story came about when I did a kind of as part of my trying to make sense of everything. I wrote this ridiculously long 750-page PhD thesis in the early 2000s, which was called Design for Human and Planetary Health, a Holistic Integral Approach to Complexity and Sustainability. Good old academic title. And at the end of it, my supervisor suggested that we needed a really wise transdisciplinary whole systems design thinker to be my external examiner. Otherwise, I would get killed by writing just such a long thesis. And so we found David Orr from Oberlin College. Uh-huh. And David came over to Scotland for my viva, and then later I visited him at Oberlin College, and I remember it was, I think, in December 2006, and I was in his study, and he was just about to go off to some meeting with Al Gore, I think it was, and we only had 20 minutes, and I said, before you go, I need to interview you on video, and I asked him a few questions, and there was one question was, what is the dimension of spirituality and the sacred in the transition that we now have to make as humanity to create a sustainable human presence on Earth? Mm-hmm. And the answer he gave me just completely floored me. You can actually watch if you Google David or Daniel Wahl interview, it's somewhere on YouTube, the whole interview. But the part of the answer that he gave me was, Daniel, before we can find adequate answers to the how we might create a more sustainable human presence and what we might have to do in the details of our houses and our energy systems and how we clothe ourselves and how we feed ourselves and all that, we need to ask ourselves a much more difficult question. And that's the question, why are we worth sustaining? And it just completely floored me. Like I just it really sort of took me back and thought, okay, that's a big question. And then he kind of went on and said, like, we need to ask questions of who are we, where are we going, where do we come from, who are we obliged to, what is the meaning, coming back to meaning of being in relationship with this living earth. And so, yeah, since 2006, up until the book actually was published in 2016, I've sort of had that initial conversation as something that I was exploring with my book, and that's why my book is also so focused on questions. It hinges on this idea that maybe as a species we've paid too much attention in the last few centuries on finding answers and solutions. And despite the fact that history keeps teaching us that yesterday's solutions turn into today's problems, and which is an invitation to be humble about our solutions today, even if we think we're the world-saving regenerative design practitioners, because who are we to know that our solutions won't have side effects? And so when I started to write the book, I realized that in order for it to have any meaning over longer periods of time, of maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 years, if I just wrote down a whole catalog of solutions of how to be more regenerative and sustainable, it would probably still be old quite quickly. But the whole book is focused on questions, because I increasingly believe that if there is such a thing as a compass that we can hand out down from one generation to the next, it's the invitation to the next generation to live the right questions and give them a kind of basket full of questions that say, these questions served us well. Keep asking them, and keep asking the question, is there a question missing? Are we asking the right questions? And I think that is much more what regeneration, keeping responsive to the transforming whole that we are participants in and emerging out of. That's what regenerative cultures is about.
Here's a question. In your research, where are you with the understanding of, are we resilient as humans?
I think, to me, one of the concepts or frames that by trying to study life and trying to study ecosystems, and like I'm originally a biologist, and then I did a master's in holistic science and then a PhD in design, and all of this was really the same exploration of how does this, what is life? How does this pattern really work? How do we participate in it in a way that we contribute to health and wholeness and right relationships in it? And there's an element in that this whole is scale linking, just as place is fractal, in the sense that what you do in Santa Fe might seem like a very local action, but it affects your locality, it affects the bioregion you're in, and ultimately it also affects the planetary system. So all of it is nested, and so the planet is just where you're sitting as well as your local community. And resilience is to do with creating enough redundancy in the system that the system can support itself at these different scales. And so the answer to your question is I think we can build resilience. We are resilient if we come back to the local and the bioregional, to asking ourselves, where does our food come from? Where does our energy come from? Where does our water come from? How do we relate to this place? What is the uniqueness of this place and this culture, the ecosystems that we inhabit? the history that of the ground we walk on. Like what does the place want? How do we thrive in this place, and how do we make this place thrive by being in it? And when we ask those questions, and I think we still have time if we do that now, and for me, that's the interesting bit about regenerative practice, is that faced with the climate calamity that we're now faced with, and faced with cascading ecosystems collapse, which we've already triggered, coming back to this more local and bioregional scale does two things at once. It, on the one hand, is preparing us to be more resilient to the storms and catastrophes that are likely to come over the next 10, 20, and 30 years. But at the very same time, if we do it mindfully in a kind of geotherapy rather than a geoengineering kind of way, and bring back our local forests and heal our watersheds and work with our soils to make them more bioproductive again, and in regionalizing production and consumption and our main, like the way we meet most of our main needs, but in ways that work with the local ecosystem and with the opportunities of place, I think we can at one and the same time build more resilience and embark on the kind of carbon drawdown and ecosystems and planetary healing pathway locally and regionally that might just, if all of us do it everywhere in global solidarity and knowledge exchange and mutual support, that might just avoid what now seems so hard to avoid, which is climate cataclysm and the end of the world as we know it.
Daniel, what would you say to the young woman, to all your studies and this beautiful book and people you've met? What would you say, or maybe you've met her, to the young woman, Greta? What would you say to her?
I haven't met her. Be interesting to have the opportunity. Greta, as a representative of her entire regeneration. I love the regeneration play on words that perfect. I often say regeneration rising or join the regeneration, and I firmly believe that she is a spokesperson for the regeneration. But so far, the message that she's been amazing at taking to the world and taking to her generation of young school kids who say, why should we still go to school if what we study for is part of a system that needs fundamentally changing, and we might not even have a future if we don't change it. The next big step for me is to connect her generation to the wise ecosystems healers who for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years have been building capacity around the world to do this healing work. And there are people in the permaculture movement, in the eco-village movement, in the regenerative agriculture and agroforestry and sociocracy and nonviolent communication. And there's so many dimensions to what we have to relearn of how to be with each other and how to be with land as healing presences again. But the network is out there, and the big work now is to connect these young people into new pathways that don't take them into universities where they spend 4 years being brainwashed into learning something that is completely out of date by the time they get their degree, but actually take them into a lived practice of becoming the regeneration rising. So if I had a chance to meet Greta, I would talk to her about how can we collaborate? How can I help link these existing networks into the people that you now speak to and that you've reached? And it's the same for folks in the Extinction Rebellion. I feel that there's a little bit too much of it's probably necessary as part of the wake-up process, but the message, I want you to panic, isn't necessarily, like, from my more whatever adult perspective, sounds patronizing to say it that way, it's not the best place to act from panic. But we need to realize that the urgency is such that it is fierce. So we need to act from hope and from the deep knowledge that we can be regenerative presences because we are life, and connecting her whole movement into a more, now I'm saying solutions, but like living the questions of how can we heal our place? How can we heal this place, this community, this ecosystem, and with it get to global scale not by scaling up large geoengineering solutions, but by scaling out very place sensitive, culture sensitive, regenerative solutions that are place sourced and culture sourced, and basically heal the whole on all levels, community by community, bioregion by bioregion, and she has the audience to bring into this movement. So who knows? Maybe I'll get to see her in Madrid.
You're going to Madrid? Okay. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I'll be there for a few days, and I've been kindly invited by the Global Peace Initiative of Women. I kind of like the fact that
how beautiful.
I get my accreditation by a organization that represents majority Earth rather than my little majority group. Minority group. I mean.
So, why come at this through design?
Because to me, the way I understand design is it's human intentionality expressed through interactions and relationships. So this could be anything from the interactions and relationships of the molecules in a glass or a chair or some object that somebody designed, but it's also the interactions and relationships in a monetary system, in an economic system, in a food system, in the way a city functions. It's the way we transform our worldview and our value system that influence what we believe we need and what we need into actions of manifestation in the world, of how we meet these needs. And so the most powerful intervention in design is actually not a physical design. It's changing the worldview and the value system, or changing the underlying narrative that we have as a culture. Because, I guess, as Winston Churchill put it, first we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. That's really true to all design. And in many ways you could say, because our economic and monetary system is also a design system that has been shaping, the capitalist system has been shaping us and how we behave for far too long. And it has done so in a degenerative way that has created this inequality, that has created all this poverty and all this suffering, and has led us to exploit people and planet for centuries now. And so it's this weird paradox between the humility and the power of agency that I always come back to, because in a way, the title of my book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, has a paradox in it, because cultures emerge. They emerge out of the relationships that we all have to each other and to the places we live in and to the world. They're not designed. But then, because we all co-created, all our words, intentions, actions, and behaviors actually do contribute to what emerges and how the future shapes up. And so for me, design is a really powerful place where we can begin to reintegrate this Humpty Dumpty of education, the Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall nursery rhyme.
Yes.
I increasingly think it's about the fragmentation that we've experienced when we split the world into disciplines and expertises of different kinds. And so we split the whole as a dynamic, interrelated process into the isolated, siloed perspectives of different disciplines and different ways of seeing and focusing. And design, to some extent, is an invitation. Designers are kind of DJs that cross all those silos and try to bring it all together in a meaningful way. And when you pay attention to that meta design, the worldview value system change, which to me is the spring, the upriver part of the design process, then you can really have remarkable influence in the world. But in a way that is not controlling or manipulative. It's more, if you come from the right intention and you set that healing intention in the system and you connect the right people with each other and you make sure that the right, like information flows that invites people into trying to be part of the healing rather than the destruction, then magic happens. And people take it the way they take it, and they make the magic happen.
What came to me from your book is an understanding that for a long time, and I mean centuries, we have been awed by our own self-reflectiveness. And that has taken us into deeper and deeper separation because, as you say, we haven't been humble. In discovering that we could see ourselves, we have been very arrogant. And so that perhaps the medicines, the psychedelic medicines, came at a time where we were ready to jump out of this obsession with separation due to self-reflection and to create a more inclusive, to accept that we are inclusive.
Yeah, I think, well, the medicines have been there throughout our entire species. I actually firmly believe that those people who've suggested that the rapid development of the frontal cortex and the kind of plasticity of our human brain to keep adapting to new environments and very quickly innovate tools and then make them part of us in the way that we've I mean, now we have computers and all those kind of things, and we're actually literally in a way that I think is mad, working towards becoming cyborgs. But to some extent, we've been cyborgs for a very long time because we're tool users. And I think all of that has probably, in our early species histories, fungi and other vines and basically sacred plants have probably played a critical role in making us who we are, I believe. And so to some extent, when we started to tell that weird story of I think, therefore I am, and disappeared out of our four senses of knowing into just one sense of knowing, and then build edifices of science and technology around that again, in that self-reinforcing, shaping the building and then it shapes us, where it then brought forth a world that we literally believe that nature and culture are separate, and that we're not first and foremost biological beings in and of a larger process that has never been broken, that is one planetary life process. And so, yeah, I think that the rediscovery of sacred medicines and then the rapid clampdown on it, because it was inconvenient for the powers that be to have people wake up to their interconnection with life and also this, because with that scientific story came this locking consciousness into a storyline that emerges out of dead matter, whoever came up with that, and also that life comes out of dead matter. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Life and consciousness are primary parts of the fabric of what we call universe. And sacred medicines are ways that allow us to not just talk about this in a sort of intellectual way, but to actually see it and feel it and be in that field, feel part of that field. And it's interesting that I don't know where things are at with it right now. I mean, I hear that a lot of people in the Bay Area have started microdosing to improve their performance as whatever field they're trying to be geeky in. But I'm not sure. I mean, you've been part of this old history of the awakening to those medicines. Do you feel that there is still the same kind of keenness to actually use this as a tool of discovery rather than just either like some party fun or like for me, I've always been very respectful of these medicines and never taken them as a kind of to have a good Friday night.
And yet, I feel there is a mischievousness in nature. Mm-hmm. And so in some way, I feel sure that even if you do this in a way that's not sacred, it will transform you. It's not part. I mean, I'm defending that aspect because I truly believe in the beginning when I did it, I had no idea what, I had no idea of the sacred or spiritual aspects, but yet it jarred me out of my, I went to school in France and it jarred me out of my Cartesian thinking, that's for sure. And I wasn't looking for that. So, but yes, I do believe that there are people who are using this profoundly to design regenerative cultures. Absolutely. And yeah, I like what the person I interviewed last week said. His name is Thomas Roberts, and he's one of the sages of my time, and he calls it mind apps. Mm-hmm. So in the idea that we can co-create at different places in consciousness, we can co-create together. We can activate these things as mind apps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even that use, like for me, the mind is like I guess it depends on where you locate mind.
Right. Beautiful. Exactly.
For me, the powerful lessons that I've learned, particularly through fungal medicines, is this deep mycelial connection to everything out there, and the way it like to just feel my own identity with it, and also be able to tap into knowledge from that field through like literally. I remember going for a walk in Wales, picking liberty caps, and how eventually the mushrooms show you the mushrooms. Like after a while,
that's wonderful.
You after having found a few and you eat them, then you tune in to the frequency of them, and then suddenly they're just sort of slightly glowing all over the meadow, and before you could hardly spot them, and then it becomes really obvious. But in a similar, it's a simple image of how we in that state can suddenly ask questions about how to be of healing influence to the ecosystem. I mean, I haven't, if I'm really honest, for the last 10 years, I haven't partaken in any sacred plants, but it's been a hugely influential part of my development, and I sometimes ask myself, have I fallen, not victim would be the wrong word, but have I somehow given in to the cultural conditioning around not doing these plants as you grow up and whatever? Because like, I'm sure that they could still teach me something today, but it's just that somehow my life hasn't revolved around opportunities to engage with such teachers. But I think that they're vital. Maybe not all the time, and that's why I still do think, like, I hear what you're saying in terms of people don't have to come with the respect, but I do find that they are powerful teachers, and if you play with them, you can also get burned. And I do know some people who got burned.
Absolutely.
And it's, I mean, you spend time with Timothy Leary. What was the triad again? It's those, like, who you do it with, how much you do of it, and the setting you do it in. But
setting, exactly.
Yeah, and for me, that's always been hugely, like, I just can't imagine doing something like that in a noisy club. I just need to be in the cathedral of the Redwoods, and like I spent a year in UCSC Santa Cruz. That was my excessive year of partaking in all sorts of things. The redwood forest up above Kursky College in Santa Cruz is like where you literally walking among mountain lions, seeing pumas, and deer and raccoons, and being in the forest. That was truly shamanic journeying for me. That I feel deeply influence even how I think today. It literally rewired my thought patterns. Interesting. I never thought I would talk about that in this conversation, but hey, there it is. Might as well be transparent.
Thank you for opening up, and I absolutely your perspective and point of view about how to have a relationship with these medicines is perfect, and I hope a lot of people hear it. I do think it is the gift that keeps on giving, and so I have great hope that even the messy situations keep working inside people's hearts and beings.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you would give us some ideas, some of your ideas about how we can, to use somebody else's phrase, we can change our minds about the way we are living.
Well, I think we live by story. We live in story. The world shows up not in a. I mean, that's what these teachers also teach us, that so much of what we're taught is perception, and this idea that you open your eyes and there's a world out there, and then it just sort of pops into your eyes, and you just sort of like a video film, you take in what's out there, rather than to understand that there's an active part in perception that is about the organizing ideas we hold, the narratives we hold, how we see what we informs what we see. And so that's what Maturana and Varela, I think, spoke to with this idea of bringing forth a world, that we need to really question our guiding stories. We need to question our underlying belief systems to the point that that's where the power of change lies. That if we reframe those frames that bring the world forth for us, the world shows up differently. And one of them is centrally, I think, this bizarre story that if you look at lots of dictionaries, it still seems to define culture and nature linguistically as some form of opposite, as if culture wasn't just an epiphenomenon of a biological process of a not so intelligent ape that likes to call himself intelligent or herself. And so if we change the stories, if we like, one of the big stories that is related to that is that life is all about, like, the minute you see life in individuals and species, like Gregory Bateson so wisely said, that the unit of survival is not the individual or the individual species, it is the individual, the species, and its environment. And so it's all together. It's all interrelated. Life creates conditions conducive to life, as Janine Benyus so beautifully puts it. Mm-hmm. And so if we can repattern ourselves to see that life, through its long story of evolution, has been primarily a collaborative process by which life has created better conditions for more life to flourish. This process of diversification and then subsequent reintegration of that diversity at higher levels of complexity through predominantly new forms of collaboration and cooperation in the system, whether it's a eukaryote swallowing another eukaryote and making a prokaryote swallowing another prokaryote and making a eukaryote. So two cells without a nucleus becoming a cell with a nucleus, and then enabling much more complex cells that could do lots of very different things. And then those cells coming together, first in colonies and then actually as multicellular organisms. All of that you can frame that story as a collaborative progress at each major jump. And then social animals evolving, or even the way that the plants of the early oceans created the oxygen that made life on land, first plant life and then animal life, possible. All of this is a reframing of our identity with life that has collaborative advantage at the center rather than competitive advantage. Exactly. And that's how we can be differently when we change those kind of stories, that we understand that the only enlightened self-interest is to work in the interest of the whole that brings us forth, rather than compete with each other and exploit people and planet. And these sort of, what seems like theory becomes really practical when you try to live it in community and in relationship to your own region and place. So I think we were all invited to heal ourselves by coming together and trying to now heal the planet, because that's what our future depends on. Our children and our children's futures depend on us who are alive at this point in human history to come together and do the impossible, to show a degree of planetary collaboration and solidarity, a willingness to fundamentally transform our presence on Earth, to transform our way of being in order to transform the way we do and bring forth the world. Yeah, may you live in interesting times. We've certainly got interesting times ahead of us to see whether we make it.
In closing, I'd like to mention a title of a chapter that you have that is Soul and Solitude in Nature. Would you riff with us about that?
It's interesting that you bring that I thought you were gonna mention the Grateful Dead title, "Wake Up to Find Out That You Are the Eyes of the World," which is one of my favorite chapters. But the soul and solitude in nature, for me, is key, because if we don't heal our misguided perception of self as something separate from world, and of culture as something separate from nature, and in a very embodied as animals first, not as intellectual human beings, experience our connection with wild nature, and experience that field phenomenon that you can sit with a question in wilderness and it will be answered by the field you immerse yourself in. The minute you let go that sharp boundary of me, human, out there, wild nature, and you suddenly find the forest speaks to you. The forest shows you where you are and who you are. And so for me, I've actually spent the last couple of days, a friend of mine was facilitating a course here in the Majorcan mountains on how to guide solo experiences, solo time in nature, in that way to help people work in personal development and leadership and whatever issues that they have, by entertaining the possibility that they can hold a deep question and walk into nature and spend, even if it's only 5 or 6 hours alone in nature, and in more than human nature, I should say, because the language is always pulls us into the dualism. And then have these transformative experiences. You don't even need to do a full kind of Native American vision quest of 4 nights and days without food and water, standing in a circle with a buffalo skin. Some people, that's very useful, and for others it's a bit too much. But even in a 4-hour guided solo, you can reconnect to something that, it's very akin to what we were talking earlier, with what plant teachers can teach us. But actually, even without ingesting a substance, just by fully immersing ourselves in that larger being that we're of, we can learn so much. And so I invite everybody who's at a point in life where they feel that something is not working anymore, something is breaking down, and repeated patterns of something not working out just keep popping up at them, to go out into nature. Just give themselves that gift of one day out in a wild place and say, what is it that I have to need to let go of in order to let come what I'm really called to be and do now? Just that one question. And 4 hours of quiet walking without anybody else around. That's regenerative culture. That's where it starts.
Beautiful. Well, I treasure this time of our improvising together, and I thank you with all my heart for being with us.
Well, thank you. It was a wonderful conversation, and it makes me want for more, actually.